Hey everyone, let's just dive right into this explainer today. We're going to break down how easily the internet takes these super complex histories and modern economic policies and boils them down into simple good versus evil stories. We all love a clear villain and a clear hero, right? It makes the world so much easier to digest. But today, we're going to use the actual source material to show you why those viral narratives often completely miss the mark.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're looking at 6 key areas. First, the Tesla-Edison rivalry myth, the fake $50,000 bonus, and the real war of currents. Then we'll shift gears into modern policy with the student debt dilemma, look at whether that's a regressive policy or progressive relief, and finally unpack the economic stimulus question. Let's get into it.
All right, Section 1, the Tesla-Edison rivalry myth. This is a story that has absolutely dominated internet history forums and pop culture for well over a decade.
So I want to ask you a question you've probably heard a million times before. Did Thomas Edison actually betray Nikola Tesla and rob him of his rightful fortune? The internet loves to paint Edison as this ruthless, greedy villain who stole everything from the brilliant, naive Tesla. It's a super compelling narrative. But let's actually look at what the historical record says.
The whole foundation of this myth basically rests on one infamous quote, where Edison supposedly laughed off a promised $50,000 bonus, telling Tesla he just didn't understand American humor. But here's the wild part. That quote literally sprang out of thin air in a 1944 biography by a journalist named John J. O'Neill. It just doesn't exist in any contemporary records, and Tesla himself never even attributed that quote to Edison in his own writings.
There is such a stark contrast between the internet's strawman narrative and reality here. The historical record actually shows profound mutual respect between the two men. Get this, when Tesla's laboratory tragically burned down in 1895, Edison reached out in sympathy and even provided Tesla with a temporary workspace. And years later, Tesla publicly called Edison a genius. I mean, that hardly sounds like a bitter, lifelong blood feud, does it? Moving on to Section 2. The fake $50,000 bonus. Let's zoom in on that specific financial betrayal that forms the whole core of this historical myth. $18 a week? That was Tesla's actual salary at the Edison Machine Works. To put that into perspective, offering a sudden $50,000 bonus back then would be equivalent to well over $1 million today. When you look at Edison's company financials, it was basically science fiction. They literally just didn't have the cash on hand to do that. So as we dig into the historical records, we see that in his own autobiography, Tesla actually blamed a manager for the broken promise, not Edison himself. Actually, historians point to a guy named Samuel Insull, a manager who was notoriously stingy as the likely culprit, if it even happened at all. Plus, Tesla only worked there for 6 months. That is nowhere near enough time to redesign 24 standard machines like the myth claims. And in Tesla's own meticulous daily journals, his final entry just says, "Goodbye to the Edison Machine Works." No rant, no mention of a massive betrayal, nothing. Which brings us right to Section 3, the real war of currents. Because if Edison and Tesla weren't sworn enemies, who actually fought this legendary corporate battle? Well, the true historical rivalry was actually between Thomas Edison, backing direct current, and George Westinghouse, who championed alternating current. Now, Tesla was undeniably a visionary. His development of three-phase AC power was a total game-changer. But in the grand scheme of the business world, he was fundamentally just a minor player. His critical patents were actually purchased and owned by Westinghouse. So it was Westinghouse, not Tesla, who was Edison's real corporate foe. If we map out their relationship over the decades, the reality becomes super clear. From their brief 6-month professional overlap in 1884 to Edison's sympathy after the fire in 1895, all the way to 1908 when rumors were swirling about a joint Nobel Prize. Tesla even stated then that the aging Edison was worth a dozen Nobel Prizes. Long after they went their separate ways, they remained highly supportive of one another. The internet just completely got it wrong. And just as historical narratives get oversimplified into good versus bad, modern economic policies do the exact same thing. That brings us to Section 4, the student debt dilemma. We're going to examine the complex realities behind a massive modern-day debate. Let's dive into a recent Global Council report that impartially outlines the political and economic landscape of the Biden administration's agenda to cancel student debt. The popular narrative often frames this as a simple moral imperative, right? Freeing struggling citizens from crushing financial burdens. But as we look at the macroeconomic reports, they reveal a much more complicated reality. First off, the sheer scale of this issue is absolutely staggering. We are talking about 45 million Americans holding $1.7 trillion in federal student loan debt. Because the U.S. government owns about 92% of these loans, it has become a massive and highly debated political issue, sparking all these discussions about executive orders and universal forgiveness.
This leads us nicely into Section 5, regressive policy or progressive relief. To figure this out, we need to look really closely at exactly who holds all this debt.
Understanding this concept is absolutely crucial. Analysts from the Brookings Institution and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget argue that widespread student debt cancellation is effectively a regressive policy. Why? Well, because measuring student debt without factoring in the future earning potential of that degree is fundamentally flawed. Think of it this way. It's like measuring a homeowner's wealth by only subtracting their mortgage, but entirely ignoring the value of the actual house. It just doesn't make sense.
And the data backs this up in a really surprising way. The top 20% of white non-Hispanic households by lifetime wealth actually hold a quarter of all student debt. Think about that. In fact, they hold more student debt than all Black and African American households combined. Because high earners often hold advanced, really expensive degrees. Doctors, lawyers. Untargeted cancellation disproportionately benefits higher-earning households who could, frankly, already afford to pay their loans. All right, that brings us to Section 6, the economic stimulus question. Let's zoom out and look at the broader macroeconomic argument here. Does canceling this debt actually boost the domestic economy?
The data points to a highly counterintuitive reality. You might naturally think that wiping out huge amounts of debt would cause a massive spending boom, right? But forgiving larger amounts of student debt actually yields a lower relative economic stimulus. Canceling $10,000 yields about a 0.13x economic multiplier, but canceling $50,000, that drops to just 0.10x. Meaning, for every dollar the government spends canceling this debt, it produces only 10 to 13 cents of actual economic activity. That's wild.
So analysts argue these extremely low multipliers happen for three main reasons. First, student debt is paid over decades. So canceling it doesn't suddenly drop a giant lump sum of cash in anyone's lap today, it just removes a monthly payment. Second, as we just saw, it's poorly targeted. It gives financial relief to higher earners who are way more likely to just put that extra monthly cash into savings rather than spending it in the local economy. And third, pushing extra demand into an economy that is already facing supply constraints, well, that often just leads to inflation rather than real growth.
As we wrap up this explainer today, we've seen how a super satisfying story about a greedy inventor stealing from a genius totally falls apart under historical scrutiny. And we've seen how a policy that sounds like a massive economic stimulus might actually just be a regressive benefit for high earners. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to consider. The next time you encounter a simple, viral narrative online that perfectly aligns with a good versus evil worldview, what else are we misunderstanding? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the sources, and remember to keep asking the hard questions.